Today we're going to talk about chapter 10, which is basically the revival of Europe. And I think we can call it Europe because this is kind of the beginning of Europe finding its strength after having lost much of that from the collapse of the Roman Empire. So Europe is going to rise again, and part of the explanation, what we talked about at the very beginning, why Europe? Well, today we can answer some of that, and we'll see how we do. So what were the reasons that Europe revives? What were the reasons that Europe is going to become so dominant later on? And also we'll take a look at the church, because the church becomes extremely dominant and ascendant in its own right in this period. So let's take a look at that. What happens? Well, first of all, there's something like an agricultural revolution that begins to occur, and I think we can say roughly beginning around the year 1000. So let's just date this and say between the years 1000 and 1300. We begin to get a revival of many things, including an agricultural revolution. Agricultural revolutions were historically landmarks. The very same thing happened to give birth to civilization to begin with. So here we are, a rebirth of agriculture, and that's because a number of things are discovered or simply renewed or simply changed. One of them is the three-field system. That was something that might seem fairly obvious, but it was not before. Instead of two fields, there's three. One of those will lie fallow, which allows the soil to recover. So people are learning how to move their crops about, how to leave some things fallow, how to perhaps fertilize a little more than they did before. And it all amounts to a very important ingredient in upping production of food. A number of other things happen as well. The windmill, the water mill, these are ways of grinding grain, and these kinds of technologies might seem primitive to us now. There's actually some, I saw them not so long ago myself in the Netherlands, where you actually have windmills still functioning. At least they're still moving about. So these are very important, using water power, using wind power, in order to bring about the grinding of grain and so on and so forth. A number of other things. Horses are going to be used more and more. They're going to replace oxen, and they're much more efficient. A number of other technologies are going to be added onto that. The horseshoe, which might sound pretty easy, pretty primitive, yet very important, allows the horses to gain more traction and prevents them from damaging their hooves. And when you take all of these things together, you begin to have something of an agricultural revolution. That means more production. Fewer people are needed to produce the same amount of food, or more people can produce a lot more food. That's going to allow people to actually leave the farm, leave the agricultural production, free them up to do other things. So you're going to have, as a result, some population moving into the cities. That means also an agricultural revolution, that population will begin to grow somewhat, not like in the modern world, of course, but certainly much more than before. So, agricultural revolution. Now, to go along with that, you have the, let's just call it a commercial revolution. Commercial revolution because, well, why does that happen? Why does agriculture revive also? Well, a couple of things have happened. One, the incursions, the barbarian hordes coming into Europe as they were before, that stops by roughly the 10th century. That had been very disruptive to agriculture and certainly been disruptive to trade. That stops by the year roughly around 1000. Another thing that's happened is that the Mediterranean has been cleared out. So the Mediterranean from pirates, a number of interlopers, particularly Arabs from the Middle East, had always been very active there. That stops, so the Mediterranean is cleared. That means trade is open again between, let's say, the Middle East and various ports in Europe. Another thing is that there's still risk, of course, for anybody who wants to engage in trade. Merchants learn how to modify or to limit risk by sharing it, basically. What's going to happen is bills of exchange will be introduced. That allows the use of the ability to transform or change one currency into another. Bill of exchange makes that possible. You begin to get also the rise of, I won't call it banking exactly, but at least more money comes into Europe, that partially as a result of the Crusades going on in this period. And that will also bring wealth there, and some of that is going to be used by merchants to sort of help as the basis for making for trade. In this period, you also have the discovery of some new silver mines that are going to be, let's say, southern Germany is one place, southern France, others. Silver is currency, Silver was, of course, the basis of the coin that was used. This is before paper money. So currency, bills of exchange, clearance of different areas from pirates. And then again, what you have in England has had a very, very widespread production of, well, sheep, production of woolens. You begin to get a number of ports in Europe where the wool will be imported, and a lot of that will be converted into clothing and textile goods. So beginning to get a lot of commerce. Also, for example, Venice becomes a very important port in this period. Venice is going to trade in a number of items coming out of the Middle East, including spices that came from the Far East, or the Silk Road, for example. So you have the revival of port cities, you have the revival of cities, and so you have what I'll just call an urban revolution as well to go along with that. What helps here? Well, the introduction or the continuity of using guilds. Guilds are very important because they organize production, and now you have a number of guilds that are beginning to prosper in cities as they revive. Also, when you begin to get the rise of the state, which is something else that happens at this point, well, the rise of the state means that kings can give more support to the cities as they begin to emerge, and you will have a sort of transaction where the kings will protect the cities, or the city-states, in some cases cities, and in exchange, of course, cities can engage in commerce so long as they pay their taxes and sort of like their tribute to the kings. So the introduction of the state, the rise of the state, that's another important factor in what is happening in this period. The rise of the state, particularly true, for example, of England, and true to some extent in France, not as true in Germany, which remains badly divided into hundreds of bishoprics, of city-states, principalities, and you name it. So a divided Germany, but that's not the case. Let's take a look at England. England is the preeminent case where you have the rise of a state. How does that happen? Well, not so easily. It happens to some extent beginning in 1066 when William the Conqueror comes along from Normandy, and he crosses the Channel, and with his men he conquers the Battle of Hastings. He conquers the England. He basically conquers the Saxons who were there before, and he institutes a new order. He introduces feudalism into England. That might sound backwards, but it's not at all the case. He simply redivides the land amongst his supporters, the earls. They become the landed aristocracy. Feudalism is where they serve him. In return, they have access, they have their own estates, they have the right to their estates so long as they serve the king, and these same earls and barons essentially will become the servants of the king as well in other areas. William establishes a tax base, the Domesday Book. He does a census, 1085, begins to collect taxes more or less much more efficiently. William establishes a judiciary somewhat similar to what we do now. Now, we'll get into the details on that. You can read about that. But between William and his successors, they establish independent judiciary, a sort of roving sheriffs. They use the institution of sheriffs to go around and kind of preside over some of these, some of the civil cases and, of course, criminal cases as well. So they have that. They establish an exchequer, that is a treasury, which is to say that something will be independent, it will be separated from the king's income. An important innovation, nevertheless. You might think that's does come a little late perhaps, but it's important also. So a number of things come along to establish the state. After, it takes a while, but the state is put on a kind of a firm foundation later on. King John I, 1215, that issues the Magna Carta. That's because he needed money in order to wage war. Magna Carta is not a constitution, but it's sort of like a Bill of Rights, but for the aristocracy only. They are protected, their fiefs or their lands are protected, and in return, they agree to pay taxes so long as their rights are protected, their rights to their land, their rights not to be put in prison for no reason whatsoever. And then after that, you also have the beginnings of what is now the modern Parliament. Parliament has very just the origins of the Parliament begin to exist. That's where the king begins to consult people who have money, and also the landed people, the same aristocracy, the barons, the earls. That goes on roughly toward the end of the 13th century. The king doesn't have to go to the Parliament, but he does. That makes for much more, much greater kind of solidarity, much greater efficiency in the working of the state. So the state, very, very important. All of these ingredients are very important. Let me mention one other thing, and that was there was a constant struggle in the Middle Ages between the kings and the Catholic Church as to who would be preeminent. In this case, in along the 12th century, Henry II, King Henry II, comes into conflict with Thomas, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and a man actually he had appointed who was his friend, and he thought he would do his bidding. Here was the conflict. It was between the canon law, church law, and the secular law that had been established by the kings. Henry wanted Thomas to simply go along with what he did, Thomas Becket, to go along with simply what he wanted, that is to say the state law comes first. And Becket, of course, chose to differ on this, and that came as a surprise to Henry. Henry, in a fit of rage, calls for the murder of Thomas Becket, and that's what happens. That the year is 1177. And you might say that establishes the sort of the future relations between church and state in England. So there will be other conflicts later on, some of them quite famous, but the state has become quite strong in this case. Secular law is going to win out in the end. All right, so you have that. Take a look quickly at some other states. France also unifies under Louis IX in particular. French unification, or French, the emergence of a strong state, is much more fitful there. But Louis IX, 1226 to 1270, is the king who really does a lot in order to establish a sort of unified, powerful presence of the monarchy and establishing of the state. Basically by establishing royal courts, the Parliament, which is the highest court of all, which is basically controlled by him, which is in Paris. He institutes a tax to fall on townsmen, in particular the tithe, the head tax. He taxes Jews very, very strongly. They were not terribly welcome in the kingdom. So when you take this into account also, as part of the rise of the state and the sort of the domination over the church, this also is an important ingredient. So much for Louis IX, who is known also as St. Louis, and as you all know, that's our city. Germany never has this kind of success in unifying. There are simply too many claims to different thrones, there's too many divisions, and so Germany remains very much divided, and that of course increases the strength of the church, at least in Germany. Let's take a look at the church. The church in this period does become extremely important. We saw that it's somewhat compromised in England, to some extent maybe a little bit dominated in France, but very, very powerful in the Germany's and elsewhere as well. So how does this happen? Well, let's take a look at a couple of popes in particular. And one of them is the Pope, he's actually known as Hildebrand, and that's before he actually becomes the Pope. He's known as Gregory VII when he becomes Pope. When he was still, in the year 1059, when he was still not, he was not the Pope yet, but he was very high up in the hierarchy, he was the one who attempts to make the church independent of the state as much as possible. And he institutes the Cardinal College. You know, cardinals, as we know today, cardinals choose the Pope. Up to this point, the German kings had attempted to do that. So from 1059 on, it's going to be the Cardinal College, which is going to be which will determine who the Pope will be. Later, Hildebrand becomes, as I said, Gregory VII, and as the Pope, Gregory VII, he's very powerful. He wants to institute reform in the church. He attacks lay investiture. That's where the kings, in particular the German kings, had actually named the popes, had actually named the hierarchy, the archbishops, the cardinals, etc. So there's a big challenge there as well, and that's going to play out in a very interesting way. What he's going to do, he's going to get a challenge from King Henry IV, the German king, who immediately says that he's not going to abide by this. He challenges the Pope. The Pope issues an excommunication against him, threatens the ban, that is to ban the entire kingdom. The entire kingdom will not have access to salvation. And so from this point on, they're on a collision course. Gregory also wants to get rid of some other things. He wants to get rid of priestly marriage. And anyway, the king challenges the Pope. What he does is, in the winter of 1077, this is 1077, he actually goes to the papal residence in northern Italy at that point. He, at least hypothetically, we think he appears in a very simple loincloth. The Pope sees him, but at the same time, the Pope, who must have had a good time watching the king subjugate himself, but the Pope finally decides, well, I'll lift the excommunication, I'll lift the ban on the kingdom, so Henry is not excommunicated after all. Well, you might say this was forcing the hand of the church in a way, but at the same time it humiliated the king. And I think, symbolically it really indicates the great power that the papacy had at this point, because kings feared excommunication. Kings feared that the whole kingdom would not have the right to go through the ritual of the Catholic Church. So when you just take this one incident, this one meeting, it really shows the power of the church. That power would also be represented, for example, Innocent III, Pope Innocent III, in 1215 calls the Fourth Lateran Council, and in that council he does many of the things that Gregory tried to do. He said the church is more powerful than any state, the Pope more powerful than any king. The church cannot be taxed by any secular ruler or by any king. There can be no secular laws which can challenge the canon law or laws of the church. And also, Innocent, as much as anybody, proclaims, first of all, against Jews, saying they must wear the yellow star, the proverbial yellow star, to indicate that they're Jewish, and also proscribes Jews, that is to say they should not hold office, they should not have the same freedoms as Christians, for example, and they should be taxed heavily, etc., etc. So when you take what he does, he also says that the Eucharist, for example, is not just symbolically true, but is actually true, and that's to settle that particular debate. The papacy, I would say in 1215, in this period, is very, very powerful. It can still challenge the state, and particularly when the state is not very strong. So between the years 1000 and 1300, the church also rises to tremendous power and authority, using excommunication, using the ban, having the sacraments as the instruments for salvation, and generally being a sort of community which is there for believers. So we come to roughly 1300, and we see that the state has risen, the commercial revolution is happening, but the church is by no means weak at this point. And we'll follow up that point next time.